Riz had destroyed better witnesses than Ben O'Neill. She had the file, the strategy, and 12 years of never losing. Then her car broke down on a dark highway, and a stranger stopped to help. The next morning, she walked into the office and saw his name on the witness list. Reese Gallagher did not believe in justice. She believed in procedure. By 7:10 a.m., she was already at her desk on the 32nd floor, a glass box overlooking a gray slice of Boston that looked cleaner from above than it ever felt on the ground. The city moved in muted layers beneath her, traffic tightening into lines, pedestrians dissolving into patterns, but none of it reached her. What mattered was control. What mattered was precision. What mattered was the case file open in front of her, structured, dissected, weaponized. CorpTech versus State. Not a trial about truth. A trial about survival. Reese leaned back slightly, eyes scanning a deposition transcript for the third time. Not because she had missed something before, she didn't miss things, but because repetition stripped away noise. The first read gave facts. The second exposed tone. The third revealed intent. Page 48. There. A pause. 3 seconds. Noted in the transcript as silence, but in reality a fracture. Then a correction that wasn't a correction. It was a recalibration. The witness had realized too late what he had already given away. Reese marked it without hesitation. That pause would cost him credibility. Credibility would cost him influence. Influence would cost him the case. That was how cases were won. Not by proving something new, but by dismantling what already existed. She flipped to the summary sheet, adding a single line in clean, precise text. Witness instability, pressure point viable. Across the room, the office was beginning to fill. Associates arrived with coffee and anxiety, their conversations low, cautious, always aware of who might be listening. This firm did not reward noise. It rewarded results. And Reese delivered results. Consistently, predictably, efficiently. That was why Gideon Vane kept her close. Not because he trusted her. He didn't trust anyone. But because she understood the one rule that mattered. Win first, justify later. Her phone buzzed once. A message. Status. No greeting. No name. It didn't need one. Vane. Reese typed back without looking away from the document. Control established. Key witness vulnerable. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Then, good. Push harder. Of course he would say that. He always did. Pressure was his language. Pressure was how he shaped people into tools. Reese didn't react. She closed the message, set the phone face down, and returned to the transcript. Push harder implied escalation. Escalation implied risk. Risk required calculation. She turned to the internal CorpTech file, restricted, encrypted, sanitized before it ever reached legal review. But not perfectly. Nothing ever was. Buried in compliance logs and audit trails were gaps, missing timestamps, redacted chains of approval, decisions made without signatures. Not illegal on paper, but dangerous under scrutiny. Reese mapped it quickly. If the prosecution found the right thread, it could unravel everything. Which meant her job wasn't just to defend. It was to control exposure, limit damage, redirect attention. She opened a separate document and began constructing a narrative, clean, logical, believable. CorpTech followed protocol. Any anomalies were procedural delays. Any inconsistencies were clerical errors. Any accusations were misinterpretations. It didn't have to be true. It had to be consistent. A knock at her door. Soft. Hesitant. Come in. A junior associate stepped inside, file in hand, posture tight. We received the updated witness list. Reese didn't look up immediately. And there's a new primary witness. Added late. That made her pause. Slowly, she lifted her eyes. Name. The associate checked the file. Ben O'Neill. Reese held the name in silence for a fraction longer than necessary, not because it meant anything, but because late additions always did. What's his angle? Former contractor. Claims internal knowledge of suppressed data. Reese extended her hand. The file was passed to her. She opened it, scanning quickly. Background. Employment history. No criminal record. No obvious leverage. That made him more dangerous, not less. Clean witnesses were harder to break. They believed in what they said. And belief made people resilient. Reese closed the file. Prep a full profile. Financials, personal history, communications. I want pressure points. The associate hesitated for half a second. There may not be any. Reese's expression didn't change. There are always pressure points. You just haven't found them yet. The associate nodded and left. The door closed quietly behind him. Reese sat still for a moment, the name echoing once in her mind before being filed away where all variables went. Categorized, neutralized, prepared. Ben O'Neill was not a person. Not yet. He was a factor. A potential disruption. Something to be studied, understood, and, if necessary, dismantled. She turned back to her screen, fingers moving again, faster now. The case was shifting. New input. New calculations. Same objective. Win. Because in her world, there was no second place. There was no moral victory. There was only outcome. And Reese Gallagher had built her entire life on one simple equation. Control the narrative, control the result. Everything else was noise. The engine died without warning. 1 second it held, steady and mechanical. The next it choked, shuddered, and went silent. Reese tightened her grip on the wheel, guiding the car to the side of the empty, suburban road with controlled precision. No panic, just assessment. She turned the key once, twice. Nothing. A short exhale. Not frustration, calculation. Phone signal, weak. GPS lagging. The nearest service point blinked on the screen, half a mile ahead. A gas station. Not ideal. Not efficient. But usable. She stepped out, heels clicking against cracked asphalt, the cold air sharper than she expected. The city felt far away here. Too quiet. Too slow. Reese locked the car without looking back and started walking. The station came into view gradually. Flickering lights, a tired neon sign, a convenience store that had seen better years. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and old sugar. A man behind the counter barely looked up. Reese moved past him, scanning. No immediate solutions. No tools. No service desk. She pulled out her phone again, forcing a signal check. Still unstable. Car trouble. The voice came from her left, casual, unforced. Reese turned. A man leaned against the far end of the counter, sleeves rolled, posture relaxed in a way that suggested he had nowhere urgent to be. Mid-30s. Observant eyes. Not intrusive. Just present. Reese evaluated him in a second. No visible threat, no obvious agenda. Still, distance remained. Temporary inconvenience, she replied. Engine failure, probably electrical. He nodded once, like that made sense to him. There's a toolkit out back. Owner lets people use it if they ask. Reese glanced toward the back door, then back at him. You work here? No, a faint hint of amusement. Just passing through. A pause. Then he pushed himself off the counter. I can take a look if you want. Reese hesitated, not out of fear, but out of habit. She didn't accept help easily. Help implied dependency. Dependency reduced control. But standing here did nothing. Time mattered. Efficiency mattered. Fine, she said. 5 minutes. He nodded. No argument. No attempt to extend the offer. Just action. They stepped outside together. The night air carried a low hum from distant traffic, but up close, everything felt contained, almost isolated. He opened the hood, studied the engine without rushing. Reese watched, arms crossed, attention sharp. Battery connections loose, he said after a moment. Not broken, just not holding. Reese stepped closer, verifying. He wasn't guessing. He knew what he was looking at. Can you fix it? Yeah. Simple. No performance. He adjusted the connection with practiced efficiency, tightened it, then stepped back. Try now. Reese got in, turned the key. The engine responded immediately, clean, stable. She turned it off again and stepped out. Thank you. The words were precise, measured. He shrugged it off. Happens. A beat of silence followed. Not awkward. Just unclaimed. Reese studied him again, this time with slightly less distance. You said you're passing through. To where? Doesn't matter, he said. Then, after a second, nowhere specific. That answer didn't fit any predictable pattern. Reese noted it, filed it, didn't push. You have a name? Ben. He didn't offer a last name. She noticed that. Reese. No titles. No context. Just names. Neutral ground. The kind that didn't exist in her usual world. There's a bar across the road, Ben said, nodding toward a low building with dim lights. Coffee here is terrible. If you're waiting for your phone to stabilize, that's a better option. Reese followed his gaze. The idea of staying longer than necessary conflicted with her instinct to return, to resume control, to re-enter structure. But her phone still showed weak signal. and the delay was already real. 5 minutes wouldn't change anything. 10 wouldn't either. One drink, she said. Then I leave. Fair enough. They crossed the road without speaking. Inside, the bar was quiet. Low music, a handful of people, no attention directed at them. They took seats at the counter. No introductions beyond names. No questions about work. Rhys ordered something simple. Ben did the same. Silence settled again, but this time it shifted, less guarded, more observational. You don't look like someone who ends up in places like this, Ben said eventually. Rhys glanced at him. And you do? A faint smile. Sometimes. She considered that. I had a schedule, she said. Now I don't. That bothering you? It's inefficient. He accepted that answer without comment, like it was complete. Most people would have pushed. Asked why. Asked what she did. He didn't. That, more than anything, caught her attention. Minutes passed. Then more. The conversation came in fragments, neutral topics, small observations, nothing anchored in identity. No mention of Boston. No mention of law. No mention of cases or clients or outcomes. Rhys didn't realize when she stopped filtering every word. It happened gradually, almost unnoticed. The mask didn't drop, it loosened. Just enough. Ben listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was direct, unembellished. No attempts to impress. No attempts to extract. That made the space between them unusually stable. At one point, Rhys checked her phone again. Full signal. She noticed it. She didn't stand up immediately. Another minute passed. Then another. You should go, Ben said, not looking at her. Rhys frowned slightly. Why? Because now you can. No expectation behind it. No invitation to stay. Just observation. Rhys held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, then nodded once. You're right. She stood, placed cash on the counter, precise, sufficient. No excess. Thank you. For the car. No problem. She turned to leave, then paused. Ben. He looked up. If you ever need something returned, you won't find me here. A statement. Not a promise. Not an offer. Just clarity. He nodded. Good to know. Rhys stepped outside, the cold air sharper now, more defined. She walked back to her car, got in, and started the engine. It held. Of course it did. As she pulled away, the station and the bar receded quickly in the mirror, shrinking into something temporary, almost unreal. Within minutes, the road reconnected to the main highway. Structure returned. Speed returned. Control returned. But something small remained out of place, not disruptive, not emotional, just unfiled. Rhys didn't name it. She didn't analyze it. She didn't need to. By the time the city skyline reappeared, it was already compartmentalized. Another variable. Another moment. Irrelevant to the case. Irrelevant to the outcome. By morning, it would be gone. That was how her system worked. And her system had never failed her. Morning restored order. The city moved with purpose again, and Rhys stepped back into it without hesitation, her pace exact, her focus narrowed to a single objective. The delay from the night before had already been absorbed, neutralized, erased from relevance. By the time she entered the courthouse, there was no trace of it left in her posture or her expression. CorpTech versus State had entered a critical phase. Today was about positioning. Not verdicts. Not conclusions. Just control of the narrative before it solidified in the judge's mind. Rhys moved through security, through the hallways, through the low murmur of attorneys rehearsing arguments under their breath. Everything here operated on tension disguised as professionalism. She thrived in it. Inside the courtroom, she set her materials down with precise alignment. Files stacked. Notes ready. Angles prepared. Across the aisle, the prosecution team gathered, quieter than usual. That meant confidence. Or overconfidence. Rhys didn't care which. Both could be exploited. She flipped open the witness list again, eyes scanning down until they stopped. Ben O'Neill. Primary witness. Scheduled first. Efficient. Direct. Risky. Rhys closed the folder slowly. Clean witnesses were unpredictable. Not because they lied, but because they believed they didn't need to. That made them harder to destabilize. The courtroom doors opened behind her. Movement. A shift in attention. Rhys didn't turn immediately. She didn't react to noise. She reacted to data. Footsteps approached. Stopped. Then a voice, low, familiar in a way that didn't belong here. Didn't expect to see you again this soon. Rhys turned. The world did not stop. It did something more precise. It narrowed. Ben stood a few feet away, dressed differently now. Structured. Controlled. Not the man leaning against a gas station counter. Not the man sitting in a dim bar with no agenda. This version had purpose. This version had alignment. And in a single second, every variable from the night before reorganized itself into a single, undeniable fact. Witness. Target. Obstacle. Reese's expression did not change. You didn't mention you were involved in a federal case. Her tone was flat. Measured. Professional. Ben held her gaze. You didn't ask what I did. Accurate. And irrelevant. Reese stepped closer, just enough to close the space into something intentional. You're testifying against my client. Not a question. A confirmation. Yeah. No hesitation. No apology. Then we don't know each other. The words landed clean. No emotion. Just structure reasserting itself. Ben watched her for a second longer than necessary, as if evaluating whether that line was real or constructed. That's one way to handle it. Reese didn't respond. There was nothing to respond to. The situation had already resolved itself into its correct form. The night before had been an anomaly. This was the system correcting it. A clerk called the court to order. Movement resumed. Positions taken. Reese returned to her table without looking back. The judge entered. Formalities passed quickly. The prosecution called their first witness. The state calls Ben O'Neill. Reese's pen moved once across her notes, underlining the name already written there. Ben stepped forward, took the oath, sat. No visible nerves. No hesitation in posture. That confirmed it. He believed in what he was about to say. Reese observed everything. Eye movement, breathing rhythm, hand placement, stability. He wasn't rehearsed. He was grounded. That made him more dangerous than any coached witness. However, when the questioning turned to his final day at Corp Tech, Ben hesitated. His fingers tightened momentarily on the edge of the stand, his gaze dropping. It wasn't a performance. It was the residue of the same guilt he'd whispered about in therapy. For a second, he looked less like a dangerous witness and more like a man broken by the weight of a truth no one wanted to hear. Reese recorded the moment. It was a fracture, but instead of striking it, she gave him a second of silence, allowing him to find his footing. The prosecutor began. Questions structured to build credibility first. Background, employment, timeline. Ben answered cleanly. No embellishment. No drift. Just facts, delivered with the kind of clarity that made juries listen. Reese didn't interrupt. Not yet. Interruptions too early weakened impact. She let it build. Let the narrative form. Let the court settle into his version of events. Then she would break it, piece by piece. But as she listened, something else registered, not emotionally, not consciously, but structurally. There were no visible fractures. No hesitation markers like the ones she had exploited in other witnesses. No correction patterns. No defensive shifts. He wasn't adjusting his story. He was stating it. That meant pressure alone wouldn't be enough. She would need leverage. Real leverage. The prosecutor guided him toward the core. Internal data suppression, decisions made above protocol, instructions that bypass compliance. Each statement tightened the case against Corp Tech. Each detail added weight. Reese made a single note. Credibility high. Direct attack inefficient. She didn't look at him. She didn't allow any trace of recognition to exist in her behavior. To her, he was already reduced to components. Testimony, structure, impact. The man from the night before no longer existed in this room. When the prosecutor finished, the judge turned slightly. Cross-examination. Reese stood. Smooth. Controlled. Every movement calculated to project certainty. She walked to the center, stopping at the exact distance that balanced authority with restraint. Her gaze lifted to Ben. This time fully. Direct. Mr. O'Neill, she began, voice steady, precise. You've presented yourself as a reliable observer of internal operations at Corp Tech. A pause. Not for effect, for control. Let's examine that. The room shifted subtly. Attention focused. This was the moment where narratives either held or broke. Reese felt the familiar clarity settle in. The alignment of intention and action. It was a move of supreme arrogance. Vane believed that by giving her the file, he wasn't just giving her a weapon. He was giving her an order that would cement her loyalty to his shadow world. This file wasn't just a weapon. It was a violation of the only principle Reese still held sacred, the purity of procedure. Vane wasn't just asking her to win. He was demanding she become a butcher, using a man's private scars as a torture device. It wasn't law, it was chaos masked by power. For the first time, Reese's internal algorithm threw an error. Winning at this cost meant a total loss of control over her own identity. She didn't close the file, she integrated it, not as a knife for Ben, but as the final proof that Vane no longer played by the rules. Night had settled over Boston like a heavy curtain, the city's streets slick with recent rain, glinting under the muted, orange glow of streetlights. The hum of distant traffic and the occasional echo of footsteps on wet pavement outside were the only sounds piercing the quiet, sterile interior of Reese Gallagher's apartment. She sat hunched over a sprawling collection of files, folders, and digital devices, every surface around her covered with the evidence she had painstakingly gathered. Each document was a thread, each email a link in a complex chain, and every note she had scribbled over the past weeks became part of a meticulously arranged map of Corpteca's internal machinations. Vane's file remained open on her laptop, the audio recording of Ben's therapy session paused, but fully cataloged in her memory. She had studied it relentlessly, noting every inflection, hesitation, and emotional spike. It was a weapon, yes, but it was also a reminder of the cost of miscalculation, of the razor-thin edge between leverage and moral compromise. The audio alone would not suffice. Ben's precision, his integrity, his ability to articulate facts with unwavering clarity made him resistant to direct manipulation. To gain true control, Reese would need more than intimidation. She needed proof, indisputable and undeniable, a dossier that would tip the scales beyond argument. She leaned closer to the keyboard, fingers moving with deliberate, almost surgical precision, tracing connections, cross-referencing internal emails, memos, financial ledgers, and obscure communications. Each anomaly she found, a missing timestamp, a contradictory internal memo, a suspicious transfer, was cataloged, annotated, and indexed. Slowly, patterns emerged. Subtle at first, then undeniable. Kickbacks disguised as legitimate expenditures, directives issued under the guise of routine protocol, suppression of reports that might have exposed wrongdoing. Everywhere, Gideon Vane's influence was etched into the system, like a spider's web spanning the corridors of power, manipulating outcomes in invisible ways. Hours passed. The world outside moved on, indifferent to the storm of calculation and revelation unfolding in one apartment. Reese traced connections across departments, verified every financial irregularity, reconstructed email chains, and mapped out internal communications with painstaking exactitude. Each discovery strengthened her position, each piece of evidence a potential lever. Vane's assumption that fear and coercion would maintain control was being systematically dismantled. He had underestimated her patience, her precision, and her capacity to anticipate moves and countermoves. By the early hours of the morning, the dossier was complete. Thick, meticulously organized, indexed with care for maximum usability. It contained every shred of evidence. Falsified timestamps, internal memos that contradicted official statements, financial transactions funneled through intermediaries, and communications between Vane and his hidden allies. Reese allowed herself a brief moment to inhale, though even then her mind remained sharp, running simulations of courtroom reactions, possible defenses, witness behavior, and judicial interpretation. Every potential outcome was cataloged and prepared for, every contingency considered, every move mapped with exacting precision. She closed the laptop, the weight of the dual dossiers final and absolute. The city outside was still a blur of gray, but the narrative inside the apartment was now hers to dictate. Every variable had been accounted for, every risk of Vane's retaliation mapped against the evidence of his own crimes. She didn't need the audio to break Ben. She needed the truth it revealed about Vane's desperation. When the sun finally touched the glass of the courthouse, Reese stood, her movements as rhythmic and certain as the law she was about to redefine. The time for observation had passed. The execution of the pivot was all that remained. Preparation had been exhaustive, observation meticulous, control absolute. And when tomorrow came, the game would change, and she would be ready. Morning light filtered into the Boston courthouse through tall, narrow windows, dust motes suspended in the sunbeams. The marble floors gleamed, polished to a cold perfection, and the muted murmur of lawyers, clerks, and spectators created a low hum that underscored the tension in the air. Reese Gallagher entered with measured steps, heels clicking against stone, each sound precise, controlled. Her files were stacked neatly under her arm, the weight of familiar reassurance. Every dossier, every note, every calculated detail from the night before was cataloged, memorized, and ready for deployment. Today, the courtroom was not a room of law. It was a battlefield, and Reese held all the weapons. Ben O'Neill sat at the witness stand, posture erect, calm, and professional, his eyes scanning the courtroom, unaware that the battle about to unfold was as much a psychological one as it was legal. Reese approached her table, glanced briefly at the judge, who gave a curt nod of acknowledgement. Her mind ran through every angle, every response, every potential challenge that Vane or his associates could attempt. She had anticipated this moment, every nuance, every pause, every inflection. She was prepared for total control. The interrogation began. Reese's questions were precise, calculated, slicing through the narrative with clinical efficiency. Each word was deliberate, designed to probe, to unsettle, to extract, but not yet to destroy. Ben answered with integrity, measured, careful, as if he knew instinctively how to navigate the tightrope she was creating. Reese felt the tension rise in the courtroom, the quiet hum of anticipation from the jury, the subtle shift in Vane's posture. He watched her, confident, expecting obedience, expecting leverage to be wielded according to his plan. Reese introduced the first pieces of evidence, not the audio from the therapy session, not yet, but discrepancies in internal memos and financial logs. She highlighted subtle contradictions, gaps, inconsistencies. The courtroom was silent, save for the soft shuffle of papers and the occasional cough. Eyes were on Ben, but the unspoken message was clear. Reese controlled the narrative. She could have used Vane's file against him immediately, forced Ben into submission, but she restrained herself, playing a longer game. Control was power, and power required patience. Vane leaned forward, a faint smirk curling at the edge of his lips. He assumed she would deploy his weapon, that she would obey. He underestimated her. Reese's voice remained calm, authoritative, her questions building a framework that highlighted Ben's credibility, exposed inconsistencies in Vane's management of CorpTech, and suggested the possibility of misdeeds without yet stating them outright. The subtlety was deliberate. She was establishing control, shaping perception, tightening the noose without revealing her full hand. Hours passed, the interrogation evolving into a tense chess match. Each answer from Ben, each carefully crafted question from Reese, shifted the balance incrementally. Witnesses observed quietly. Lawyers on both sides remained vigilant, but the undercurrent of Reese's control was unmistakable. She was mapping reactions, cataloging micro-expressions, noting hesitation, calculating probabilities. Every pause, every glance, every inflection was recorded mentally, stored for immediate or later use. Then came the pivot. Reese leaned slightly forward, her tone unchanged, but the subtle shift was noticeable only to those paying attention. She introduced a new line of questioning, one that indirectly highlighted Vane's own inconsistencies, his patterns of coercion, the discrepancies in his internal dealings. The courtroom responded instantly. Even the judge's eyebrows lifted slightly. Reese's methodical preparation allowed her to frame the narrative in such a way that suspicion began to creep toward the man who had intended to manipulate the situation entirely in his favor. By midday, it was undeniable. Reese Gallagher held the courtroom. Every element she had prepared, every calculated move from the night before, every minute detail she had memorized and cataloged was in play. Vane's smirk faded imperceptibly, replaced by the faint tightening of his jaw. The balance of power was shifting rapidly, and the courtroom had become a stage for the culmination of Reese's exhaustive preparation, observation, and strategic manipulation. The first phase of the battle was over. Reese controlled the narrative, shaped perception, and prepared for the next move, the deployment of the evidence that would ultimately unmask Vane's corruption completely. But for now, she observed, measured, cataloged every reaction, ensuring that when the moment came, nothing could derail the trajectory she had meticulously crafted. The stakes were higher than ever, the tension palpable, and Reese Gallagher remained fully, irrevocably, in command. The courtroom felt smaller somehow, the weight of anticipation pressing down like a physical force. Reese Gallagher remained seated, calm, every motion controlled, every breath deliberate. The file she had prepared lay neatly stacked, a tangible reminder of the advantage she now held. Hours of interrogation had shifted the subtle currents of perception. Ben had maintained his integrity, Vane's confidence was faltering, and the jury's attention was increasingly focused on the inconsistencies Reese had methodically highlighted. The stage was set for the decisive moment. Reese rose, her movements smooth and purposeful. Her eyes scanned the room, resting briefly on the judge before moving to Vane. The subtle tension in his posture was visible to anyone who knew what to look for. He had assumed he controlled the game, that his threats and coercion would direct her actions, that his file would compel her to bend. He had been wrong. Reese had laid the groundwork for this weeks ago, identifying Vane not as a defense witness, but as a hostile witness whose testimony was essential to verify the integrity of the encrypted files. The judge had granted the motion in camera, a procedural time bomb that was now ticking directly under Vane's seat. The hook was a footnote in a financial filing Vane had personally signed last quarter. Under Federal Rule of Evidence 801D. 2. His signature made his personal explanation for administrative anomalies mandatory for verifying the authenticity of the metadata. Reese had filed a motion to compel his testimony on the grounds that only the signatory could confirm the absence of tampering in the encrypted logs. It was a procedural checkmate. Vane could not refuse without effectively admitting the documents were fraudulent. It was a procedural ambush, perfectly legal and impossible to ignore. Reese stepped forward, her voice calm, but carrying a sharp edge of authority. "Your Honor," she began, projecting confidence without aggression, "I would like to call Gideon Vane as a witness." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge tilted his head, eyebrows raised. Vane's eyes widened slightly, a micro-expression of disbelief flashing across his face before he composed himself. The power had shifted. Reese had turned the very man who had sought to control her into a target, a piece on the board she now commanded. Every carefully documented discrepancy, every internal memo, every recorded communication with CorpTech that revealed his corruption was now poised to be unveiled. Reese began her questioning with surgical precision. She presented documents, internal memos, and email chains, each carefully annotated, each time-stamped, each cross-referenced with facts Vane had assumed were hidden. She guided him gently, deliberately, forcing him to explain inconsistencies, contradictions, and actions that now clearly pointed to corruption and coercion. The courtroom was silent, all eyes focused on the exchange. Vane, normally composed and unshakable, began to fidget subtly. Micro-expressions, slight hesitations, and the tightening of his jaw betrayed the unraveling of his carefully maintained facade. As the interrogation progressed, Reese introduced the piece de resistance, the meticulously documented evidence of kickbacks and suppressed reports. Every detail was undeniable. Every record perfectly corroborated the others. The strategy she had crafted in the quiet of her apartment the night before, the long hours of meticulous research, observation, and cataloging, culminated in this moment. Vane's eyes darted across the documents, the realization dawning that the leverage he had assumed over her had been turned against him. The courtroom held its collective breath. Witnesses leaned forward, lawyers shifted in their seats, and the jury's attention was riveted. Reese's questions were calm but relentless, guiding Vane to admit, clarify, and inadvertently expose the full extent of his corruption. By mid-afternoon, it was complete. Vane's network of coercion, corruption, and manipulation had been laid bare. Reese Gallagher had orchestrated the turnaround with precision, transforming the situation from one in which she had been under pressure to one in which she held absolute control. The courtroom, which had earlier been a stage for intimidation and manipulation, had now become the arena in which truth and preparation triumphed. As the judge absorbed the weight of the evidence, Vane slumped slightly in his chair, the veneer of confidence stripped away, leaving only the exposed, vulnerable figure of a man whose misdeeds could no longer be hidden. Reese remained calm, composed, her face a mask of professional detachment, even as a surge of satisfaction ran beneath her controlled exterior. Every calculated move had succeeded. Every risk had been anticipated. The court had seen the truth, and it had been revealed with surgical precision. Reese Gallagher, seated again at her table, allowed herself a single, controlled breath. She had executed the plan flawlessly. Vane's leverage had been neutralized, his authority undermined, and the path forward was now hers to command. The tide had turned completely, and the courtroom, once a venue of pressure and manipulation, had become the arena in which her meticulous preparation and strategic brilliance had triumphed. The next steps would follow, but for now, she had orchestrated the decisive pivot, and the outcome of the day was under her control. The courtroom had transformed into a chamber of mounting tension, each corner humming with anticipation. The usual murmurs of a trial had been replaced by a charged silence that stretched taut across the polished marble floors. Reese Gallagher remained seated at her table, poised, composed, and fully in command. The files before her were a physical manifestation of weeks of tireless preparation. Cross-referenced emails, memos with contradictions highlighted, financial ledgers revealing hidden kickbacks, and every recording, every piece of evidence meticulously annotated and indexed. She had spent hours mapping the subtle shifts in human behavior, tracing the invisible chains of command, and simulating the courtroom's responses to each revelation she planned to deploy. Now, all of it was converging into a single, unstoppable crescendo. Gideon Vane, who had once carried himself with the air of untouchable authority, sat rigidly in his chair. His carefully cultivated confidence was eroding, replaced by a tension so subtle it might have been missed by anyone not attuned to human behavior. His jaw tightened, lips pressed into a thin line, eyes darting to documents he once assumed were secure. His every micro-movement betrayed the recognition that the meticulous web he had spun around Corptecha's operations was being unraveled before his very eyes. Reese's strategy was working with absolute precision. She had transformed the tools he intended to use against her, intimidation, leverage, corruption, into instruments of his own exposure. Vane wasn't just losing the argument. He was losing his composure. The silence that followed his stutters spoke louder than any testimony. The judge, observing the shift in the courtroom's energy, exchanged a quiet, almost imperceptible signal with the court clerk. Within moments, federal investigators, arriving silently and deliberately, took positions throughout the room. Their presence, though restrained, was immediately commanding. It signaled that the case had escalated from a city-level trial to a matter of federal scrutiny. Reese registered each step, every subtle shift in Vane's posture, and the changing focus of the jurors. Her preparation had accounted for this escalation. Every frantic glance, every twitch of defensive instinct, every possible line of defense had been anticipated and cataloged. She remained an island of control amidst the growing storm. Reese began her deliberate movements, gathering her files, repositioning herself with careful attention to posture and presence. Her mind cataloged each potential interaction, the judge's likely questions, the possible objections from Vane's counsel, the reactions of federal agents, the murmurs of the jury. Every variable had been considered, every potential outcome anticipated. The city outside might have been oblivious, but within these walls, Reese orchestrated a symphony of controlled pressure. Vane's network of manipulation, coercion, and corruption, once invisible and untouchable, was now laid bare for every observer, every camera, every agent present. Reporters' cameras flashed as the tension reached its peak, capturing the drama of the courtroom and the arrival of federal authority. Reese's composure never wavered. Every step she took was deliberate, calculated, and precise. The movement of her hand, the placement of documents, the timing of each gesture, all contributed to the perception of complete command. Vane, by contrast, grew increasingly aware that his once untouchable position had crumbled. He was now navigating a labyrinth of exposure. Unable to regain control, each defensive move anticipated and countered by Reese's meticulous planning. As the judge called a recess to allow the federal agents to assess the situation, Reese rose, securing her files with deliberate care. The courtroom buzzed with the charged energy of imminent consequence. The federal investigation had begun, Vane's corruption had been exposed, and the stage was set for a cascade of legal and corporate fallout. Reese moved through the room with calculated calm, cataloging reactions from every observer. Jurors leaning forward, counsel murmuring, reporters capturing every motion. Her victory was not just in the evidence. It was in the perception she controlled, in the orchestration of every element of exposure. Later, returning to the quiet of her apartment overlooking Boston's sprawling cityscape, Reese allowed herself a measured breath. The city was indifferent, unaware of the magnitude of the events that had just transpired. Her preparation, her careful analysis, and her execution had resulted in a complete reversal of power. Vane's authority dismantled, Corp.Tech's corruption exposed, and the federal investigation underway. Reese Gallagher had achieved what few could. She had converted leverage into liberation, manipulation into exposure, and her exhaustive preparation into a decisive triumph. For the first time in 10 years, she allowed herself the rare luxury of peace. The meticulous orchestration of strategy, the patient accumulation of evidence, and the precise execution of plan had culminated in a flawless victory. She had navigated a maze of power, pressure, and corruption with absolute control, emerging intact, unshaken, and utterly commanding. Tonight, she would sleep knowing that every detail had been executed perfectly, that every variable had been accounted for, and that the power she wielded was complete, precise, and irreversible. Boston's streets were cloaked in early evening shadows, the city's pulse continuing indifferent to the upheaval that had just erupted within its courthouse walls. Reese Gallagher moved through the quieted corridors of her apartment building, each step measured, deliberate, and mindful of the long journey that had led to this point. The federal investigation was underway, Gideon Vane's empire exposed, Corp.Tech's internal corruption laid bare, yet Reese's mind did not linger on triumph. Instead, she cataloged possibilities, assessed risks, and planned her next steps. Control had been regained, justice, her version of it, had been served, but the city of Boston would never again hold dominion over her life. Packing her modest belongings, Reese methodically sorted her files, leaving behind only what was necessary. Each document, each carefully annotated record of the trial and Vane's corruption, was secured digitally, encrypted, and cataloged. The decision to leave Boston was not impulsive. It was calculated, strategic. A smaller, private practice in another state offered autonomy, control, and the opportunity to rebuild on her own terms, free from the moral compromises and pressures that had defined her decade-long career. In the early morning light of her departure, a message arrived on her phone. One word: thank you. Ben O'Neill. It was concise, understated, yet carried the weight of the gratitude that words alone could not convey. She paused, reading it twice, allowing the significance to settle. Their connection, forged in fleeting moments of vulnerability and tested through the crucible of courtroom battle, was not erased by the chaos or by distance. It was a reminder that some truths, integrity, loyalty, and courage, transcended circumstance. Reese arranged to meet Ben on neutral ground, a space untainted by the memories of coercion, corruption, and compromise. Their meeting was quiet, deliberate, and unhurried. No past deceit, no hidden leverage, no secrets clouded the interaction. Conversation flowed naturally, building from casual observations to the unspoken acknowledgement of shared experience. Trust, fragile yet resilient, began to reassemble itself in real time. Every glance, every pause, every subtle gesture reinforced the possibility of a relationship founded not on circumstance, but on choice, mutual respect, and understanding. At one point, Ben looked at her, really looked at her, and asked if she missed the view from the 32nd floor. Reese didn't have to calculate the answer. For the first time, she didn't look for a strategy. She just watched the way the light hit the table and realized she preferred the view from where she stood. As they spoke, Reese felt the rare sensation of balance, a life lived deliberately, with agency intact, where strategy, integrity, and emotion could coexist. Boston and its trials remained behind her, a completed chapter marked by precision, perseverance, and unflinching dedication to her principles. Ahead lay a new beginning. The quiet control of her practice, the freedom to operate without compromise, and the opportunity to redefine the contours of her personal and professional life. The city lights flickered as the conversation drew to a close. Ben's presence, steady and grounding, was a reminder that even amidst upheaval, there were constants worth preserving. Reese allowed herself a moment to appreciate the culmination of her journey. She had dismantled corruption, preserved integrity, maintained control, and reclaimed her life. The challenges of the past decade had not defeated her. They had refined her, honed her capacity for strategy, and strengthened her resilience. As night settled over the horizon, Reese Gallagher looked forward with measured optimism. The move, the practice, the new chapter with Ben, each represented a deliberate choice, an exercise in autonomy and calculated courage. She had survived the storm, executed her plan flawlessly, and emerged with control over her destiny intact. For the first time in years, she could embrace the future on her own terms. The city behind her was no longer a battlefield. It was a memory, a testament to her skill, patience, and unyielding will. Tonight, she would sleep, finally unburdened, fully in control, and ready to define the life she had fought to reclaim. The new office in Connecticut was small, sunlit, and entirely hers. No glass towers, no 32nd floors, just the steady hum of a practice built on her own terms. Ben had visited twice, the conversation moving from the fallout of Vane's sentencing to the quiet logistics of a life reclaimed. There was no pressure for a narrative, no forced outcome. As she looked at the first case file on her desk, a pro bono wage dispute, Reese felt the familiar clarity return, but this time, it wasn't cold. She reached for her pen, her movements still precise, still deliberate, but finally untethered from the system that had tried to own her. The strategy was no longer about survival. It was about the work. Of course, it wasn't perfect. Some nights, she still woke up analyzing imaginary risks, and the silence of her new office sometimes felt too loud after the roar of Boston. But now, when she looked at a to-do list, she was no longer looking for traps. She was just looking at the work that needed to be done. And for now, that was enough.